Imagine this, a single piece of copper wire, the kind you'd pull out of an old extension cord sitting in your garage, costs less than $2. You twist it into a spiral, wrap it around a wooden stake, push one end into the soil next to your plant, and point the other end up toward the sky like a tiny antenna. That's it. No batteries, no electricity bill, no product to buy. And within weeks, the plant beside that wire is growing so fast your neighbors start asking what fertilizer you're using. You tell them, nothing, just copper and sky. They don't believe you. And honestly, that reaction, that disbelief, is exactly why this knowledge disappeared for over 200 years. Not because it didn't work, but because nobody could sell it to you. Here's the question nobody in the $200 billion fertilizer industry wants you to ask. What if the atmosphere above your garden is already buzzing with electrical energy, flowing down toward the earth every single second of every single day, free, silent, and completely ignored? What if your plants have always been able to tap into it, and all they ever needed was a $2 piece of wire to make the connection? Today we're going back to 1703. We're going back to a French priest who discovered something so threatening to modern agriculture that the industry spent decades making sure you never learned his name. Stay with me, because what comes next will permanently change the way you look at every plant you've ever grown. Let's talk about the machine that benefits most from your ignorance. The global fertilizer industry is worth over $200 billion a year. $200 billion. That number is so large it's almost meaningless until you break it down. It means that every single year, farmers and home gardeners around the world collectively spend the equivalent of the entire GDP of Portugal just to feed their plants. And the companies sitting at the top of that supply chain, BASF, Yara International, Nutrien, Mosaic, have every financial incentive in the world to make sure you believe there is no other way. Because here's the truth they've built their entire business model around. You must buy what your plants need. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the holy trinity of commercial fertilizer, must come from a bag, must come from a factory, must come from them. That belief, that single assumption, is worth $200 billion annually. And it has been carefully, quietly, systematically reinforced through university research funding, agricultural extension programs, and decades of marketing dressed up as science. Now ask yourself, who funds most of the agricultural research that gets published in mainstream journals? A 2021 analysis by the Food and Agriculture Organization found that over 60% of applied agricultural research in developed nations receives direct or indirect funding from agrochemical corporations. 60%. That means the science you've been told to trust has been shaped, filtered, and in many cases quietly buried by the same industry selling you the solution. This is not conspiracy. This is economics. When a $200 billion market exists, protecting it becomes a strategic priority. And the most efficient way to protect it is not to suppress knowledge violently. It's simply to defund it, ignore it, and let it fade into obscurity while the textbooks are rewritten around what's profitable. Electroculture didn't disappear because scientists proved it wrong. It disappeared because it was free. And free doesn't build a $200 billion empire. So what exactly was lost, and who lost it first? To answer that, we have to travel to 18th century France, to a laboratory that looked more like a monastery than a research facility, where a Catholic priest was about to accidentally discover something that would take the world another 200 years to remember. The year is 1783. France is 7 years away from revolution. The steam engine is barely a decade old, and a Catholic priest named Pierre Bertholon de Saint-Lazare is standing in a garden outside Lyon, holding two metal rods connected to a primitive electrical apparatus, watching his lettuce grow. Abbé Bertholon was not a farmer, he was a physicist, one of the most respected scientific minds of the French Enlightenment, a contemporary of Benjamin Franklin, a man who corresponded with the greatest thinkers of his age. And what he observed in that garden was so unexpected, so structurally threatening to the assumptions of his era, that even he struggled to explain it. Plants exposed to controlled electrical fields grew faster. Their leaves were larger. Their root systems were denser. He documented everything in a 1783 treatise titled De l'électricité des végétaux, on the electricity of plants. a work that caused a brief sensation in European scientific circles and then quietly vanished. For a few decades, the idea flickered. Other researchers picked it up. In 1844, a British scientist named Dr. Forster conducted systematic field trials showing that electrically stimulated wheat germinated 40% faster than control groups. In 1880, the Royal Agricultural Society of England published reports on experimental plots where atmospheric electrical collectors increased crop yield by measurable margins. The science was imperfect, the mechanisms poorly understood, but the results kept appearing across different countries, different crops, different climates. Then came the 20th century, and with it, a man named Justin Christofleau. Christofleau was a French inventor and agricultural experimenter who spent the 1920s developing what he called magnetico-electric antennas, spiral copper coils mounted on wooden stakes designed to concentrate and conduct atmospheric electrical energy directly into the soil. His 1925 book, published in both French and English, detailed specific construction methods, ideal copper gauges, optimal spiral directions, and documented results from farms across southern France where his devices had been installed. He reported yield increases ranging from 20% to over 100% depending on crop type and soil conditions. He was not a fringe figure. He presented his findings to agricultural bodies, corresponded with researchers, and built a small but serious following among independent farmers who had nothing to gain from lying about their harvests. And then the Second World War ended, and everything changed. Between 1945 and 1960, the global agricultural landscape was fundamentally restructured. The same chemical plants that had spent the war producing explosives, using the Haber-Bosch nitrogen fixation process developed in Germany, were retooled almost overnight to produce synthetic fertilizers. Suddenly, there was an entire industrial infrastructure that needed a market. Governments, eager to solve post-war food insecurity, partnered with these companies to push chemical agriculture as the modern, scientific, rational solution to farming. The Green Revolution was born, and anything that didn't fit inside that chemical framework, including 2 centuries of electroculture research, was quietly shelved. It wasn't burned, it wasn't banned, it was simply never funded again. University agriculture departments pivoted toward chemistry. Research grants followed the money. And Christofleau's copper spirals, Bertholon's electrical gardens, Forster's germination trials, they sat in archive boxes, undigitized, uncited, slowly forgotten by a scientific establishment that had decided for financial reasons what the future of farming would look like. The knowledge didn't die. It just stopped being profitable to remember. But here's what those archive boxes still contain, and what the $200 billion industry never managed to erase: the actual physics, the actual mechanism. The reason this works, explained not by 18th century priests or 1920s French inventors, but by NASA, NOAA, and peer-reviewed atmospheric science published in journals that have nothing to do with farming at all. And that explanation is stranger and more beautiful than anything Berthelon could have imagined. Here is something that is not debated, not fringe, not alternative science. It is published by NASA, confirmed by NOAA, taught in atmospheric physics programs at universities around the world, and has been measured continuously since the 1800s. It is called the global electric circuit, and almost nobody who grows plants has ever heard of it. The Earth carries a net negative electrical charge on its surface. The upper atmosphere, specifically the ionosphere, sitting roughly 100 kilometers above your head, carries a net positive charge. Between those 2 layers, separated by the air you breathe every day, there exists a permanent, planet-scale electrical potential difference of approximately 300,000 volts. 300,000 volts maintained continuously, powered by the roughly 2,000 thunderstorms firing simultaneously around the globe at any given moment, acting like generators in a circuit that never switches off. Now here is where it gets relevant to the $2 piece of copper wire sitting in your garage. Within that global circuit, there is a constant downward flow of positive ions from the atmosphere toward the negatively charged Earth. This flow, measured in the fair weather regions of the world, far from any storm, runs at approximately 2 picoamperes per square meter of ground surface. 2 picoamperes. That is an almost incomprehensibly small current. A single LED light requires roughly 1 trillion times more current to illuminate. At that scale, it sounds like nothing. It sounds irrelevant. And that is precisely what the mainstream agricultural conversation has always assumed, that a current this small could not possibly influence biological systems in any meaningful way. That assumption, it turns out, is wrong. And the proof comes not from electroculture enthusiasts on the internet, but from the field of bioelectromagnetics, a branch of science that studies how living organisms interact with electrical and magnetic fields at the cellular level. What researchers in this field have established, through decades of work at institutions including the University of Washington, the Bioelectromagnetic Society, and research programs in Germany, Japan, and the Netherlands, is that biological systems are extraordinarily sensitive to electrical signals, not because they need large currents to function, but because they have evolved over hundreds of millions of years inside the global electric circuit, using its signals as environmental information. Plants, it turns out, are not electrically passive. They generate their own weak electrical fields. Their cell membranes maintain precise voltage gradients that regulate nutrient transport, root growth direction, and metabolic activity. The opening and closing of stomata, the microscopic pores through which plants breathe and regulate water loss, is an electrochemical process. The movement of calcium ions through root cell walls, which triggers growth responses, is governed by electrical potential. At every level of plant biology, from the molecular to the whole organism, electricity is not an external force acting on the plant. It is part of the plant's internal operating language, which means that the atmospheric electrical environment surrounding a plant is not irrelevant background noise. It is part of the signal environment the plant has always been listening to. And when you introduce a copper conductor into that environment, a material with one of the highest electrical conductivities found in nature, shaped into a spiral geometry that concentrates electromagnetic flux, you are not doing something artificial to the plant. You are amplifying a conversation that has been happening between plants in the atmosphere for 400 million years. This is the mechanism, not magic, not pseudoscience. Atmospheric physics meeting plant bioelectrochemistry at the level of ion exchange in the root zone. And the next question, the one that will make you look at soil completely differently, is exactly what happens in that root zone when the current arrives. Because what happens there is where the growth begins. Let's go into the soil, not metaphorically, literally, because the most important action in your entire garden is not happening above ground where you can see it. It is happening in the top 30 centimeters of earth, in a world so dense with chemical exchange, biological negotiation, and electrical signaling that a single tablespoon of healthy soil contains more interactions per second than the entire internet. When the copper antenna conducts atmospheric electrical charge down into the root zone, the first thing it encounters is the soil solution, the thin film of water that coats every soil particle and serves as the medium through which plant roots absorb everything they need to survive. This solution is not pure water. It is a complex electrolyte loaded with dissolved minerals, charged ions, organic acids, and the metabolic byproducts of billions of microorganisms. And like every electrolyte, it responds to electrical input. The specific mechanism that electroculture researchers and bioelectromagnetic scientists point to is called cation exchange, the process by which positively charged mineral ions like calcium, magnesium, potassium, and ammonium detach from soil particles and move into the soil solution where roots can absorb them. This process is normally driven by hydrogen ions released by roots, a slow chemical negotiation that depends heavily on soil pH, microbial activity, and moisture levels. Under normal conditions, it is the primary bottleneck limiting how fast a plant can access the minerals it needs to grow. Speed up cation exchange, and you speed up growth. It is that direct. What the small electrical current conducted by a copper antenna does, according to research published in the journal Electromagnetic Biology and Medicine, and in independent trials conducted at the University of Guelph in Canada as recently as 2019, is accelerate ion mobility in the soil solution. Charged particles in an electrical field move faster. They detach from soil surfaces more readily. They migrate toward root surfaces more efficiently. The plant is not receiving more minerals than are present in the soil. It is accessing the minerals already there at a faster rate with less metabolic expenditure. The result in controlled trials across wheat, tomatoes, lettuce, and legumes was accelerated germination rates of between 20% and 40%, increased root biomass of up to 35%, and above-ground growth increases ranging from 18% to 62% depending on soil type, moisture conditions, and plant species. Those numbers are not revolutionary in the way that sounds clean and simple, and this is the moment where intellectual honesty requires a pause. Electroculture is not a universal solution. It is not a replacement for healthy soil biology, adequate water, or appropriate sunlight. In heavily compacted, mineral-depleted soils, the electrical stimulation has less to work with. You cannot accelerate the exchange of ions that are not there. In extremely dry conditions, where the soil solution is too thin to conduct effectively, the mechanism breaks down. Peer-reviewed research in this space remains limited, partially because funding for non-commercial agricultural research has been systematically under-prioritized for decades, and partially because the effects are genuinely variable across different growing environments. The University of Guelph trials, while promising, were conducted under controlled greenhouse conditions. Field results from independent farmers show a wide range of outcomes, some dramatic, some modest, some requiring multiple growing seasons before measurable improvement appears. This is real science. Real science acknowledges uncertainty. But here is what is not uncertain. The global electric circuit is real, cation exchange is real, ion mobility in electrical fields is real, plant bioelectricity is real. The individual mechanisms that electroculture depends on are not in dispute. What remains under-researched is the precise degree to which a copper spiral antenna, installed by a home gardener next to a tomato plant, can reliably harness those mechanisms under real-world conditions. That research gap exists not because scientists investigated and found nothing, but because no corporation has ever had a financial incentive to fund the answer. And this is exactly where you become more important than any research institution. Because right now, across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and increasingly across North America and Australia, thousands of independent gardeners are running the experiment themselves. An online community on Reddit under the name Electroculture has grown to over 100,000 members documenting their own trials with photographs, growth measurements, and seasonal comparisons. These are not scientists. They are people with gardens and questions and $2 worth of copper wire who decided to stop waiting for permission to find out. You are not a passive consumer of agricultural products. You are someone who just learned that the atmosphere above your garden is electrically alive, that your soil is an electrolyte waiting to be activated, and that a technique suppressed by the economics of a $200 billion industry costs less than a cup of coffee to implement. That changes what you are. That changes what this garden is. You are not tending a hobby. You are conducting a reclamation. And the next question is the practical one, the one that actually matters right now today in your garden. Exactly how do you build this antenna? What copper gauge, what spiral direction, what depth, what distance from the root zone produces the best result? We have 2 centuries of experimental records, a community of 100,000 active testers, and the physics of the global electric circuit to draw from. The beauty of this is its simplicity, not the performed simplicity of a product designed to look easy while hiding its complexity behind a patent, but genuine, physical simplicity, the kind that makes you slightly angry when you realize how long you went without knowing it. Here is what you need. A length of bare copper wire, not insulated, not coated, bare copper, the kind found inside old electrical extension cords, stripped speaker wire, or grounding cable from a hardware store. The gauge matters more than most electroculture guides admit. Research from Krista Flo's original 1925 documentation, cross-referenced with modern community trials, consistently points toward a medium gauge wire, approximately 1.5 mm to 2.5 mm in diameter, which corresponds to 14 to 16 AWG in the American wire gauge system. Too thin, and the wire lacks sufficient surface area to collect and conduct atmospheric charge effectively. Too thick, and it becomes rigid, difficult to spiral cleanly, and disproportionately expensive. A 10-meter length of 1.5 millimeters bare copper wire from a hardware or electrical supply store will cost you between 30,000 and 50,000 Vietnamese dong, roughly 1.5 to 2 US dollars. That same 10 meters will build you 3 to 4 complete antennas. Compare that to a standard 1 kilo bag of NPK chemical fertilizer, retailing at $8 to $15, which feeds one plant for perhaps 6 to 8 weeks before it needs replacing. The copper wire, installed correctly, works continuously for years without replacement, without reapplication, without a repeat purchase. That comparison is not incidental. It is the entire economic argument condensed into a single sentence. Next, a wooden stake. Not metal, wood. This is not arbitrary. A metal stake would itself become a conductor competing with your copper spiral, potentially disrupting the directional flow you are trying to create. Wood is a mild insulator that holds the copper in position without interfering with its function. A bamboo stake, a dried tree branch, a rough-cut timber offcut, anything between 0.5 meter and 1.5 meters in length, depending on the size of the plant you're working with. Tall plants with deep root systems benefit from longer stakes that allow the antenna to extend higher into the atmosphere while the ground contact reaches deeper into the active root zone. For most home garden vegetables and young fruit trees, a stake between 80 centimeters and 120 centimeters is sufficient. Cost, effectively zero if you use material already available in your garden. Now the spiral. This is where direction becomes important, and where the physics intersects with something that initially sounds like it belongs in a different kind of video entirely. The Earth's magnetic field interacts with the atmospheric electrical field in ways that make the orientation of your copper spiral geometrically relevant to its collection efficiency. In the Northern Hemisphere, which includes Vietnam, where the Coriolis effect produces a specific rotational bias in atmospheric ion flow, the spiral should be wound clockwise when viewed from above, moving upward from the base of the stake toward the top. In the Southern Hemisphere, counterclockwise. This mirrors the rotational direction of natural atmospheric vortices in each hemisphere. And while the effect of getting this wrong is not catastrophic, your antenna will still function. Getting it right appears, based on community documentation, to produce more consistent results. Wind the wire in tight, even spirals, leaving approximately 1 to 2 centimeters between each coil. Do not let the coils touch. Contact between loops creates short circuits that reduce the antenna's collection surface area. Leave roughly 15 to 20 centimeters of straight wire at the top, pointing upward and slightly outward from the stake, like a fishing rod extended toward the sky. This exposed tip is your primary collection point, the interface between your device and the atmospheric charge flowing downward through the global electric circuit. At the base, leave another 20 to 30 centimeters of straight wire to push directly into the soil. This ground contact should reach into the active root zone, not just the surface, but deep enough to be in consistent contact with the moist soil layer where root activity is highest. For most garden beds, this means pushing the wire end down 15 to 25 centimeters below the soil surface, angled slightly toward the main root mass of the plant. The moisture in this zone is essential. Dry soil is a poor conductor, which is why in extended dry periods, you may want to water the base of your antenna installation more attentively than surrounding areas, simply to maintain conductivity in the immediate vicinity of the wire-to-soil interface. Placement relative to the plant matters. Christoflow's original trials and the preponderance of modern community documentation suggest positioning the stake between 10 and 20 centimeters from the main stem of the plant, close enough that the ground contact wire sits within the outer edge of the root zone, far enough that the stake itself does not physically damage established roots during installation. For larger plants or fruit trees, multiple antennas positioned at intervals around the drip line of the canopy have shown stronger effects than a single installation, effectively creating a collection perimeter rather than a single point source. 1 antenna per plant for small vegetables, 2 to 4 for medium shrubs and young fruit trees. Installed once, maintained by doing nothing except occasionally ensuring the top wire remains upright and the ground contact has not been disturbed by digging or heavy rain erosion. No schedule, no reapplication, no subscription. The sky does the rest. The same sky that has been doing this for 400 million years, waiting for something conductive enough to complete the circuit. You have now built what a French priest in 1783 spent years trying to describe to a world that was not ready to listen. The question now is whether that world, or at least the part of it growing food in backyards and balconies and community plots, is finally ready to look at what actually happened when people tried this at scale.